Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone, for coming along. I know this is an unusual time for a CBCS seminar, but Mark Costello is giving the talk today. So he's been good enough he's in photo. I don't know how to pronounce it, Mark. Close enough. In Norway. So I was looking up that it's 67 degrees north. So it's in the Arctic Circle. So it's pretty cold. So, well, even pretty cold now, this time of year. It's summer, so 24 hours light, but it's only in the morning there. So thanks, Mark, for getting up early and giving this presentation. You've seen Mark's bio, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is that Mark is a world leader in protected areas and biodiversity in the ocean. And I was impressed with, 280 publications, 70 PhD students. That's impressive. But probably what really struck me was that Mark's leadership in bioinformatics and databases. And so two really important databases that we use a lot in marine systems. One is WORMS, the World Register of Marine Species. So Mark was seminal in putting that together, and we use that for the taxonomy of all marine species. So that's excellent resource. And the other one is OBIS, the Ocean Biogeographical Information System. So that's got data, tens of millions of records of mainly the presence of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of species. And so Mark's been instrumental in putting both those databases together, which are very, very valuable for people. And that latter database, OBIS, Mark and I collaborated a few years ago now, and it was really good to have one of Mark's PhD students was leading it, and we looked at biodiversity, the latitudinal biodiversity gradient, and see that over time there's been a dip at the equator. Not only previously it's been peaking, biodiversity peaks at the equator, but over time there's been a dip that's emerged because of climate change and species moving away. So Mark has shown a lot of leadership in some very novel applications of huge data sets. And so look forward to your talk today, Mark, on marine protected areas. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Well, yeah, when I was early in my career, I couldn't figure out anything of major theoretical advance. I thought I should do some useful things. And so that's how I ended up putting together the World Register of Marine Species and OBIS. Marine protected areas is also something useful. And some of the ideas here are influenced by the late Bill Ballantyne, who was nicknamed the father of marine reserves when I was living in New Zealand for 16 years. He was one of my closest friends. We used to meet regularly at his house. And so you might notice some of that during the talk if you've read some of his papers. So my own background, as I started my PhD actually in the only marine reserve in Ireland, which sounds wonderful, but I was there recently, and it's not being managed at all, really, hardly. Then later on, I managed a project in Ireland where we mapped. It was the largest ecological survey ever around the coast of Ireland, using scuba diving and walking on seashores, where we mapped the. We took samples to plan where it would be best to have marine protected areas, and those recommended sites we had are now part of the European Natura 2000 network. So I was involved in marine spatial planning in the 90s. And then when I was in New Zealand, I was involved in habitat mapping in the marine reserve there. And then I taught Bill Ballantyne's course after he had retired for many years. And I managed the Facebook Marine Reserve site where I post one item a day to do with marine reserves. And now I'm leading a project in Europe called MPA Europe, which is going to be planning using systematic conservation planning to determine where it would be optimal to have marine protected areas in Europe. So as you know, in New Zealand, the way I've organized this talk is about kind of surprises, myths, and some misunderstandings to do with marine reserves, because at many meetings I'm at and what you read in the literature, you often hear comments or criticisms of marine reserves And some of these are what Bill Valentine called invented problems, and used to tease scientists that we're very good at inventing a problem that doesn't exist because we like to do research and we wonder about things. So I was based at Lee, which is up in the north east of New Zealand there, and you can see New Zealand's had a great record in increasing its number of marine reserves. There's actually another 4 or 5 now added to this list. And it was set up for the university. In fact, the Marine Reserves Act in New Zealand is still, its purpose is for scientific research. They haven't updated it to what they should be saying. Of course, it's for nature conservation, which is what most reserves are managed for, but actually the aims are for scientific research. So okay, the expectations of setting up marine reserves, and I think the reason I'm mentioning this is because we should think that we should realize that we don't really know what's going to happen when we've lots of marine reserves around the world because we haven't had them. But the idea here was to have a marine reserve in New Zealand for university research. We assumed the public would stay away. And the only thing they predicted that fish would lose their fear of people. But the opposite kind of happened. So you end up with hundreds of thousands of people coming to see this reserve. The fish did lose their fear of people. So now you could have strings of kids tied together, floating on the sea, surrounded by fish. It's just a wonderful experience. And it became so popular that actually it motivated the authorities to have more, to try and spread the public visitation to other sites. But we also discovered, and the Experiencing Marine Reserves program, which I believe is now in Australia as well, is just amazing with tens of thousands of people now been taken to snorkel inside and outside reserves. And people see the difference. You don't need any more science at this stage to show people what the benefits and what happens when you create marine reserves. And the now well known in the scientific literature, trophic cascade. So when the marine reserve was created, there's a photograph on the left here of sea urchins who have grazed the rocks bare. And on the right, what happened a few decades later when the kelp recovered. And that took about 20 years to have effect. And Roger Grace, who was one of the first scuba divers at Lee Marine Reserve in the 70s, he drew this lovely diagram showing how when you have no fishing, you have an abundance of large snapper and spiny crayfish. And there's a trophic cascade when you don't have them, whereby sea urchins become very abundant and graze the rocks bare. And this is now, and this is the habitat map from Lee. So it's also amazing that in the 70s, the scientists at the lab thought it might be useful to have a habitat map. They had no idea why it might be useful. They just thought it might be useful. And at the time, they thought the habitat was relatively pristine. But the point I want to make here is that this is the reserve with the island in the center, and these are zones that the scientists defined for purpose of monitoring. And the boundary, the actual boundary is the red line here. I've just taken that there was a green line earlier. Oops. Which is the official boundary, but they put the sign in the wrong place. So the effective boundary is a little bit further in. But what I think is really interesting is that these urchin barrens still exist right on the boundaries of the reserve. So the fish actually seem to know where the boundary is. It's just amazing that at that scale, you can see the effect on fish behavior. And if you drop video cameras inside the reserve, fish will swim over immediately to inspect them. You drop the same cameras just tens of meters outside the reserve and the fish won't come anywhere near them. So in fact, fish are kind of like birds. They know where it's safe and where it's not safe to be. And this phenomenon of trophic cascades has now been noticed everywhere in the world. So that was one of the first lessons and I think surprises from marine reserves. And it's important when we're talking to terrestrial ecologists that what we're doing in the ocean is fundamentally different to what we do on land when we harvest it. In the ocean, we're harvesting predators, so the effect on the food web is immediate. Whereas in the terrestrial ecosystems, we largely harvest plants and herbivores. So we end up with these trophic cascades, and they probably also occur in pelagic ecosystems, but they're much harder to define. And I think the only example has been of the Northwest Atlantic cod trophic cascade, which is another interesting story. But there's a list of myths and understandings, which is I've now got 9 on my slide. It started with 2 or 3. So I've broken my first rule here by having too many points on one slide. But I'll run through these as you can read them there sequentially during the talk. So I think when we call an area protected, it's reasonable to assume that it's protected and things aren't hunted and killed. This is what we'd imagine on land. We also think IUCN, which has 7 categories of protected areas, that countries would follow these. And there's a world database where countries enter their list of protected areas. You would think that that's all very good and well managed. But actually, most protected areas in the ocean, at least, don't even aim to be protected. Over 90%, and I've checked this, we had a paper on this a few years ago, but the numbers are still more or less the same, allow fishing. And we don't know how much fishing they allow. So going back to that earlier slide, if you have even a small amount of fishing, you're going to affect the food web immediately and the ecology of the system. And what is also happening is if you look at this graph here with the red dots, are they fully protected? And the black line is the partly protected, or if they're even protected. Is this gap is getting wider over time. So in the early days, in fact, the very first marine reserves were only fully protected. But as people had more, they allowed fishing in them. And the other statistic that I think is even more depressing is that 3/4 of coastal countries don't even have one no-take marine protected area. And this pattern is more or less the same on land. So you can see this widening gap in both situations. So it seems that as countries go towards their 30% protected areas by 2030 target, are they really doing it, or are they just labeling areas as protecting areas and doing it? And the other issue is that they're not using any systematic conservation planning internationally. Within countries, some countries have used systematic conservation planning, such as Australia and California, Israel. I think some of the Baltic countries as well are now doing that. Okay, so well, I nicknamed these some of the cons in conservation, that people think an area is protected, but it's not. And that we're exaggerating the amount of protection that's happening over time, and countries, what the countries are reporting into the database is actually what they call protected areas. And countries are not obliged to follow the IUCN guidelines. So many of them don't. They just make up their own categories. When I arrived in Norway here, the website said that a marine protected area is an area that is more protected. It didn't say more protected than what. So that was their only definition. And they have some areas they call marine protected areas, but you could basically do whatever you like. And some of them have fishing camps set up right in the middle of the protected areas. So they actually have more fishing inside them than outside. And often it's presented, particularly in Europe and North America, that setting aside areas for nature conservation is some kind of radical idea. Yet we set aside areas on land all the time for the public good, for schools and museums and universities and art galleries and sports fields and so on. So why don't we have such same areas set aside for the public in the ocean? And it's also set aside that, well, you can't, got freedom of movement in the ocean. Well, you don't everywhere. There's many areas of the ocean that the public are limited in their access to, from fish farms to harbors, cable zones and pipelines. People aren't allowed fish near these as well. And I often wonder, if we calculated this area that people are already excluded from, this may already be greater than the amount of marine reserves we have. And the other myth is that only commercial fishing impacts ecosystems. So you often hear of marine protected areas set up and they ban industrial or commercial fishing. But in fact, that's not true either, because even subsistence fishing thousands of years ago has been shown to have overfished certain species. And I think there's more examples than I have here. There's examples in the Mediterranean in Roman times. And we've also had examples in New Zealand and I think in the United States where recreational fishing also has a similar impact as commercial fishing in terms of its effect on the food web and the ecosystem. So it actually doesn't really matter who kills a fish or why they kill it. The important thing is how much fishing is happening. But I would go further and say that recreational fishing is in fact counterproductive. So people have this idea, well, a few people taking fish is all right, but in fact, if you create an area where there's only recreational fishing allowed, then it attracts recreational fishers. So you get more and more fishing, and generally there's no limits on the number of people, and often those people have quite large, they can take quite a lot of fish per person. So this is the same effects. And it also strikes me that you would never suggest this in a developing country, that we should only be allowed to fish for sport in an area and not for food. People would be horrified at that idea. They would think this fishing for sport or recreation is something rich people can afford, and is not socially equitable. Regarding pelagic species, there's been recently some very nice work on the MPA off Hawaii. That's what the blue circles are on the left map here. This is the boundaries around this very large marine protected area set up by as a monument by President Bush. And they have found that before and after, you can see this, the lines are the relative abundance of tuna species, that afterwards you get this increase in the number of species. And this happens 100 nautical miles, 200 nautical miles, and 300 nautical miles from the reserve. So in fact, there's a huge spillover of tuna from the reserve. So it'd be really interesting to know if the tuna actually also know that it's safer inside the reserve and it's not so safe outside. And it wouldn't surprise me that fish learn where it's safe not to be predated by people. So that's knocked a few things off the list. So running through the others, another claim is that marine protected areas are expensive. I've personally been harangued at a conference in Barcelona some years ago where I was talking about marine protected areas. And several people in the audience, dismissed the idea of marine reserves as something only rich countries could afford. But actually, this is not true at all. And in many countries from Africa and Pacific, as you know, have traditional no-take areas. And other countries in the region have also set aside large areas of their exclusive economic zone as all protected. And in hindsight, this is kind of common sense because it's the precautionary principle in practice. So you can set aside your whole country as protected, your whole country's sea area, and then consider what would be allowed within it. So you could always, as with any law, you can always get permits or special licenses for certain activities to take place within it. So we can see that the largest marine protected areas, as you probably know, are around the Pacific and Indian Oceans, but there's some now emerging in the Atlantic. So I wonder why don't other countries follow the Pacific island nations and apply this kind of common sense? And it's actually a low cost method of managing erosion because it's precautionary. So earlier this year, I had been keeping track of studies. There's hundreds of studies have shown the ecological benefits of fully protected areas. But the question about whether fisheries benefit has always been criticized. And anytime there's a few studies here and there, the critics would say, oh, well, that only applies in that situation because of these reasons. But I've been keeping a little list of these. And so I published a paper this year where I found 46 examples of marine protected areas that benefit fisheries. Of those examples, 90% were fully protected, no-take MPAs, and the others had partial subsistence take. And I couldn't find what I found even more surprising, I couldn't find one example of where a marine protected area was created and that there was any loss to fisheries. Yet even yesterday, I found that ICES, which is the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea in Europe, did a report for the European Commission, and they calculated how much fisheries would be lost by the creation of marine protected areas. And this is entirely hypothetical because there's actually no evidence anywhere that any fishery has ever lost due to a marine protected area being created. And in the paper, I list several reasons why this may be the case, from the marine protected areas being very small but I think in what there is more evidence, which I'll show in the next slide, that is this is due to the spillover effect, that the fish stocks recover so quickly that you actually end up boosting the fisheries outside. So we have a little infographic on that. And the important thing is, as well, is that this is a phenomenon has been observed in many countries around the world. So you can't assume that any of these case studies is somehow isolated. So I think this is a general rule, that marine protected areas not only benefit ecological interactions, but benefit fisheries. And they also have they can have benefits to tourism, depending on the location and the situation as well, of course. And generally, the older the marine protected areas, the better the benefits to tourism, probably because knowledge about the area and the tourist facilities and transport systems are more available. So another point that occurs frequently is that marine protected areas displace fisheries. And Bill Ballantyne actually called this one of his invented problems. And he argued that, well, fisheries are very dynamic. They use different gears. Fishermen will fish in different places at different times. They're already very dynamic, as are their fishery resources that they're trying to catch. So is there really any effect? And actually, nobody's ever shown an effect of fisheries displacement due to MPAs. So, but you hear about it so often, you think it must be true, and somebody must have looked it up. Well, now a paper that's in press in PNAS has looked at this, and they use the Global Fishing Watch data set to go back and look at marine protected areas in the past. And they found that fishing effort from Global Fishing Watch, they don't have catch data, of course, was decreasing around the marine protected areas. So in the graphics in the paper aren't very attractive from a visual point of view, but you can see in this one of their figures here that inside the MPA, of course, you get a decrease in effort, as you'd expect, because they were only studying fully protected marine protected areas. But outside the MPA, up to 100 kilometers, you're also getting this decreased effect. So they then use this data to predict what would happen under future marine protected area expansion scenarios. They looked at 2 or 3 of these, and they looked at a business as usual scenario. So under business as usual, there would be increasing fishing effort around marine protected areas and everywhere, because effort has to keep increasing because we've already maximized most of the fisheries. So if we want to maintain the catch, we have to increase effort. And of course, in the long run, that's going to lead to the collapse of more and more fisheries. But they predicted future decreasing effort under all of these future MPA expansion scenarios. I think this is quite an exciting discovery, because it kind of goes back to what people at a local scale would have believed from marine protectors and shown this as a general phenomenon. So marine protected areas are not expensive. I think the only reason they're expensive is sometimes because a new government agency is now responsible for their management, and that maybe there was no management in the area before of fisheries or anything. So often this is a kind of like what Ballantyne called a little turf war within government agencies, that the budget for an area now has to shift from the resource use department to another department. It's a little bit like what has happened in forestry in many countries, where forestry is now shifted to forestry for the public good rather than forestry for wood. And the more one reads about the evidence that comes through, it's clearer and clearer that partly protected areas don't really work. In fact, most of them don't even aim to work. There's some sort of compromise where they pretend that they're protecting something, but they allow people to do whatever they want. In fact, this is the case in my local marine reserve here in Norway. And there's actually more exemptions of things that you're allowed to do than things you're not allowed to do. The only thing you're not allowed to do is do research. You need a permit, and to take seaweed. But you can do anything else in the marine reserve. And the minister was asked by some journalists about this huge long list of exemptions. And the minister said, of course, if people want to do something, they should be allowed to do it. And this led to a TV show, a political satire show, making a joke of this whole thing and said, well, we could extend this to all sorts of areas of life, and people want to do something, they should be allowed to do it. So it makes it all a little bit silly. But this is the practice of partly protected is really, it's shocking. I mean, European countries allowed seabed trawling, and they're only talking about not having seabed trawling in marine protected areas by 2030. So it's such a shock to most of us that they would even allow trawling in an area they call protected. So at least 30%, or 25%, depending on the figures and which countries are included, of European Natura 2000 sites, which are supposed to be designated for nature conservation, don't even qualify as protected areas. So you might also ask, what about the social and political or other benefits of these? Well, there's a really nice study by John Turnbull from your neck of the woods down there in Australia. And he found when they interviewed people along the coast that people didn't really see the benefits of partly protected areas because, you know, they could see the benefit though of fully protected because they knew that there was a lot more fish in the fully protected, and they felt good about having some areas that were being protected for nature, and they felt it was right that there should be such areas. So really, partly protected areas don't work from a social point of view. They don't work ecologically or for fishery benefits. And you know, if we reflect on when does part protection work for anything, it really doesn't work for almost anything. I mean, we don't take half our medicine or public health or in business. When you do something, you should do it properly. So another little, I noticed that Anthony and some of your colleagues there recently published a paper on systematic prioritization for the global oceans in the mesopelagic zone. But there's now been 6 studies using data-driven methods to determine where it would be best to have marine protected areas in the ocean in terms of coverage of marine biodiversity. This is in addition to at least maybe 18, my last count, papers proposing areas in the ocean that should be biodiversity-rich spots. And these have a lot of overlap. So all the circles here are the numbers of areas overlapping between these different studies. So, this is all fine, and you think these papers go back to 2014, I think. Selig study was one of the first. And yet I was at the Convention on Biological Diversity workshop, technical workshop at ecologically or biologically significant areas, and nobody there was familiar with these studies. They had no idea that scientists had actually published studies about where it would be best to have marine protected areas. So they were still working on the basis of, oh, somebody in the area volunteer a place to be called an EBSA, and then they would have a workshop and they would justify it. So there's so much bias in that process that they acknowledge at the workshop, and yet the convention never mentions any of these systematic driven studies. And an analogy might be if we were looking at species conservation. When we look at species conservation, we look globally at the species and we work out which species are the most threatened. And species that are threatened globally will get higher importance within a country. But for some reason, when countries think of biodiversity more generally, they don't think of what's mostly globally important. They look locally. And I think it's time that we started revisiting this because, of course, these kinds of prioritization studies can be rerun using different data. But you can see even here now with many different studies, you're seeing areas that overlap, and all of these studies use different data sets, spatial resolutions at different times. So there are places that keep coming out as being important. And the other way of looking at this is wondering, well, if we protect so much of an area in a hypothetical situation, how many species or what elements of biodiversity can we include? So myself and Chen Zhao have recently looked at the 77,000 species that have range maps in the IUCN Red List. About less than 1/3 of these are threatened species. But just to take these as an example, and what we find here agrees with pretty much all the previous studies on selected taxa and selected habitats. And that is that you'd need to protect at least half of the planet, the land and the sea, if you wanted to include all species. So the 30% targets that are proposed by 2030 can never include all species. So we need to, and that this is only in the hypothetically optimal situation. So, which isn't going to happen. So what do we do with all those species that are going to be outside these protected areas? And should these protected areas be fully protected? Because if they're not fully protected, well, they're not going to be protecting all species very well either. For example, there's places protected for birds where fishing continues as business as usual. So it's called a protected area, but only for certain bird species. The other important thing I think in this type of analysis is that the 10% could actually include of the ocean, which is the bottom axis, or the land, could include about half of all species. So it's actually this first 10% that's the most important. So maybe we should be focusing on the really optimal best 10% of the planet to be protecting, because that will capture most species. And then we can look at other areas which might have more mixed management. So that's pretty much all those myths and understandings knocked off. But on a slightly, and we want to move this situation from unprotected, which is pretty much the way it's been until recently, to a more protected area. So now we see that these benefits is not just some nice situation where we want to have some natural biodiversity in some places, but this is actually going to be good for fisheries and fish stocks. So fisheries need to embrace the idea of having marine protected areas where there's no fishing in the long term as part of fishery management. And the other thing that is a difficulty in governance is that often the public and future generations don't really have a voice in this situation. And the ocean is everybody has a right to use in the ocean because it's a public resource. So fully protected marine MPAs or marine reserves have now been shown to be a safe haven for these species. They provide tourism, food security, and they have an insurance value perhaps against climate change and other factors as well, because if you've got resilient populations with high abundance, probably then high genetic diversity, they may be more resilient to other changes. It's not radical because traditional communities often had words actually for these areas like rahui and other phrases for areas that are set aside for no fishing. Of course, it's very important that local communities are involved in this because they're the ones that will make it happen in the long run. Another benefit we noticed in the very first example is that by having an area with no fishing at Lee, they discovered that this was the control or reference site and that outside fishing was having quite a big effect. So in fact, what we've been doing pretty much so far is this kind of great experiment on the oceans where it's an uncontrolled experiment where you do all sorts of things and we don't really know what's natural anymore, unless we have some areas where there's no fishing and other impacts are limited. And hopefully this will become normalized in the future. So kind of a more optimistic note, we recently compared the UNESCO produced the State of the Ocean report. This is the second one, I think. And we mapped species in the Ocean Biodiversity Information System to the areas defined by protected seas. So there's actually three sources now of marine protected area data. There's the World Database in Protected Areas, which countries put in data, and that data has not changed. That's whatever countries put into it. But MPA Atlas in the United States independently vets all these protected areas against their criteria. And another organization supported by NOAA in the United States called Protected Seas has checked the fishing regulations for all these areas around the world. They've checked the actual documents online. So this is a big job. They have a team of perhaps 10 people over 10 years doing this. So they classify protected areas according to 5 different levels of fishing. So they've determined that about 9.5% of the ocean is partly protected and about only 1.2% is fully protected. The MPA Atlas comes up with about 2 or 3%, nearly 3% fully protected on their criteria. So we barely even started protecting the ocean. But what is amazing is that many of the species in Obus have occurred in one of those partly protected areas, half of them, and threatened species, 72% have. Of course, those threatened species are often wide-ranging animals like turtles and birds and large fish and marine mammals. So they're likely to be passing through these areas. So in fact, it's kind of surprising and maybe promising that we already have a lot of species reported in Obus that are in this system. And in the highly protected, about half the threatened species have occurred at least once in their database. We don't know if they're still there, but it's sort of promising that they could be. So to conclude, I'm having a conference next year on marine protected areas and marine spatial planning here in Bodo, and the information's on the MPA Europe website. So really welcome all of you to come there. We're just opened the website to abstract submissions, and and it'll be relatively low cost because we're subsidizing it from this European project we have. Thank you very much. I can't see anybody, so.
Thanks a lot, Mark. That was, as usual, a provocative and a controversial, maybe not that controversial for the audience, but it would be controversial in some audiences. So thanks very much for that. That really gets us thinking. Any questions for Mark?
Yeah, it's great to be an academic and not reliant on things, because you can say, and also to be getting old, because then don't have to worry about being promoted or getting a job anymore. So I can say things how I think they are.
A benefit of getting older.
Yeah.
I'll kick off questions then. So you focus a lot on fishing in that presentation. Yeah. What about other threats, such as, say, deep sea mining, which is still sort of coming, I suppose, but also shipping, cables, oil and gas, aggregate extraction, etc. Do you see them as just less important, or should we be having protected areas that exclude all those activities, or just some, or should we be able to have shipping go through these areas as well? What are your thoughts?
A very good question. Also, wind energy, windmills at sea is a big growing issue around the world. And of course, we need renewable energy. So I think people are generally supportive of it. But I'm quite surprised about how even some people in the nature conservation community are completely against any type of industrial activity. They call it wind farms in the sea. And actually, when you read the Convention on Biological Diversity's recent documents, they never mention seabed trawling anywhere. I just find it extraordinary. And yet, seabed trawling has got to be the biggest impact we're having on the oceans. And some countries are banning it, like Indonesia and Chile are trying to force it out. So I think we need to have a holistic perspective and sort of do some triage on what's the most and worst impacts. And I would probably argue with wind energy, we don't really know a lot about the effects because we haven't had much monitoring of farms so far. So we need to do it and monitor and see what the effects are. And I used to be quite worried about bird impacts. And then as recently, they've been doing some monitoring in Ireland on the wind farms. And they find that most of the seabirds fly well below the blades. So they're not impacted because many of the seabirds don't fly very high. And the ones that do fly high can fly above them. So in fact, the impacts in some areas are negligible, certainly compared to fishing. Yeah, deep sea mining and all these other thin cable zones. Well, I think cable zones and pipelines have a relatively low footprint, a bit like wind farms. So the footprint is quite low. And shipping lanes is an interesting one. At one of our workshops with marine spatial planning stakeholders, we had people from the cruise industry. And they were really interested in marine protected areas because they wanted to share that knowledge with their customers, because it's a big win for them if they can tell their customers, now you're visiting a marine protected area and this is why it's so wonderful. So this is what they wanted. And but then afterwards we were talking about it, they said, well, there's certain lanes that they have to travel in. And there's no fishing allowed in those lanes because you can't have cruise ships and other big ships flying through with fishing boats. So they said, well, what impact would they be having on the seabed? Probably none. On the pelagic, probably none. So actually, maybe some of these fishing lanes are also having a conservation benefit we hadn't thought about before. I haven't heard of anybody actually looking at that. So
Yeah.
there may be side benefits, and this is the other area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, that are being talked about now as well in the convention, about other areas that are benefits to biodiversity, even though that wasn't the original intention.
I think there has been some recent work highlighting that there could be some reasonably high impacts on elasmobranch sharks and rays of shipping, just because they're neutrally buoyant, they're neutrally buoyant, so they sink once they're dead. So if they get hit, so things like whale sharks, etc. But yeah,
Yeah, and
it's
of course,
a lot less.
whale collision. Yeah, of
Yes.
course. Yeah.
So Peter Baxter has said, thanks, Mark. Great talk. Very interesting contrast between terrestrial, marine, and full partial protection.
Yeah. I've become more involved talking to the terrestrial people recently, and it's quite interesting that their perspectives are even more variable than ours. Because in many terrestrial situations, they've accepted human altered landscapes as natural. They never imagined them going wild again. I found that quite surprising. So, in fact, in the marine situation, we've some idea of what a wild marine environment might be like that is less impacted. But in many countries, the European countries, they've no idea because it's been so managed by people for so long.
Yeah, interesting. Are there any hands up? Everyone's shy.
Well, I hope it has been a big eye opener to me about the fishery benefits, because I'd always assumed that fisheries are losing something due to MPAs because people just say it all the time, and yet there's no evidence of it. So it makes you wonder as a scientist, how many things are we saying or do we believe in that we've never really dug in and said, is there really evidence that this is the case?
Well, I'll follow up on that then, because in that analysis that you did, so did you consider all the, the total fishery or the total stock in that area, or just I mean, most of the studies that I've seen on the benefits of MPAs have been sort of very local effects and don't always consider, if you've got a large MPA, most of them have been on small coastal MPAs.
Yeah.
And so then they
Yeah.
look at export of fish around that, and that's always been sort of positive that I've seen. But like if you
Yeah.
have a very big MPA, then you're going to, and that was put in an area that was previously fished, then that effort is going to be displaced somewhere else. It might be a long way away, hundreds of kilometers away, and unless you analyze over large areas. So what did you find? Like what sort of analysis did you?
Yeah. So in the paper, my paper, I think all the examples are coastal, FR1, which is the Hawaiian one. And this recent paper that's coming out now by MacDonald and Christopher Costello, who's no relation of mine, but you know him probably
Yes.
well from publications, in PNAS. So they discussed some examples of the Taiwanese fishing fleet due to the fisheries responses. So I think the Taiwanese basically gave up fishing in the whole region because they said, well, if we can't fish in most of the region, it's not worth our while traveling that far. But this then gets involved in the whole government subsidies of fisheries, because actually, if they remove the subsidies, many fisheries wouldn't be economic straight away. So probably large areas would be left, remote areas would be left unfished. And I guess it's a matter of scale. So one could also argue, well, we should have bigger areas for pelagic species or species that need more space. And the other thing is we compare to terrestrial to birds. We protect areas for birds, which are highly migratory, which have some benefit, but they don't protect the birds everywhere they are. So yeah, there's a whole list. I'm not really answering your question, perhaps, but it is a matter of spatial scale, isn't it? Because if you have maybe if you have a bigger one, you'd have bigger benefits. or more resilience. More research is a cliche, but yeah. I think we're only at the beginning. If we don't have these marine reserves, we can't ever know the answers to some of these questions. So having some of the first ones and having some data on what the responses of the ecosystem and the species is kind of key to knowing what really happens. And the worst thing would be not to do things because we imagine there won't be a benefit.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Emma's got a question. Do you want to ask that question, Emma? I can read it if you want, but
yeah. Oh, I see. So there is some in the box now.
Yeah.
Yeah, great to hear from Peter. Isaac.
So I'll read Emma's question.
About the social sciences. Yeah. I think that is very interesting because actually MPAs in practice, it really is it's a human activity. It's a social activity. So that kind of, and the social perspectives are not only about making money from it, but often the political benefits and the economic benefits. It is difficult though but the social and economic things are very difficult to do research on. They started looking at doing some economics on the reserve at Lee, and they have done a couple of papers. But the problem is, where do you see the economic benefits, locally or through the region? And if that local area gets economic benefits, are they taking economic benefits from somewhere else? So I find the social and economic impacts are quite difficult to do research on compared to the actual field science is almost easier. And then with the social side, do we just look at local communities, or do we look at nationally, or do we look at all the people that vote for the government? What's all their perspective? So there's different scales, again, when we look at the people. So I'm afraid, Emma, I don't really have an answer for you, but it's a tricky question. There's plenty of studies now at local social communities and showing that many of them do like their marine reserves. There's a well-known case in the Canary Islands where the fishing community has been wanting more and more marine reserves, much to the embarrassment of the government, as also happened in New Zealand, and because the government says, "What? You want more? Why?" And much to the embarrassment to maybe some of their scientists who. Yeah.
All right, Emma says thanks. Diego, why don't you ask your question?
Yeah. If Diego wants to talk. Yeah, who benefits more from MPAs, local small scale or industrial fishers? Well, maybe local small scale, because industrial fishers generally have a very large area for which they fish. So an MPA is probably only going to affect a very small fraction of their fishery area compared to a local scale fisher. And industrial fishers tend to treat fish as a commodity, and they're run by corporations. So I'm not really sure if, whereas local fishermen are collecting them either for food for themselves or their local community. So they place a much greater value on those local fish than probably industrial fishers do. In fact, you look at the history, I've been reading some of the books in Britain and Ireland about local history of fishing, and there's always been this concern from local communities that they're losing out with increasing industrialization of fisheries. That's just the same as you see in Asia and Africa and other countries as well. And governments seem to be just hands off all the time, and you eventually end up with corporations and big industry taking over all the fisheries. Yeah, there's been some exposés in the business pages of the Irish Times about certain companies in Ireland which ended up getting cheap bank loans and buying these massive ships and end up buying quota and basically taking over a lot of the industry, and more people having to retire and give up from fishing. Just the same as you see happening in other countries. Yeah. Politically, actually, this is interesting. I have been talking to politicians in Ireland, and some of them are elected by local communities. So they really don't care about big industrial fishing companies. They care about their local community. And those politicians are actually now looking at marine protected areas with their local fishing communities as a way of protecting their local communities and those populations in rural areas, because they know industrial fisheries don't do that, and so politically it's quite interesting.
Thanks, Mark. There's another question from Fikri on the chat.
Oh yeah, yeah. So it was kind of fun when we were doing a course in New Zealand. We'd asked a common question to the Department of Conservation managers of the sites to say, well, what do you spend most money on? What's expensive? And unanimously, it was signage. The cost of putting up some signs was more than the salary of a manager for a whole year. It is just ridiculous, because you often have to get concrete and big, weatherproof wood, and then the signs get blown down by the winter storm. You have to put it all up again. So their budget is mostly spent on signs telling people not to fish in the reserves. It sounds crazy, but and then, of course, if you get a lot of people there, then you have to improve the roads, you have to have parking, you have to have toilets and waste disposal. So all that infrastructure for managing people, which is arguably a tourism benefit, is actually coming out of the Department of Conservation budget. So instead of the Department of Conservation actually managing nature or doing something for nature, they're actually managing people most of the time. That's the biggest cost.
Mark, so the tourism, is there a question about tourism there, if you want to?
Yeah, I think the alternative livelihood. Yeah, that's certainly the case in many areas, but many marine reserves may not be suitable for tourism as well. Some are and some aren't, depending on their location. I think the success in New Zealand of its whole marine reserve network was because the first one was accessible to people, and people were encouraged to go there and see it. And when people saw it, they just said, well, why can't we have one at our house, our town as well? So it was like, Bill and I used to say it's like chocolates. If you've never had a chocolate before and you have your first one, you want another one. So we used to say marine reserves are like chocolates. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, so in that case, that had a big effect on public perception. So I'd almost argue that every country should have its first marine reserve near a central population where people can visit it with the proper infrastructure and they can witness what it's really like. And then all this stuff about fishery displacement and scientific graphs and ANOVA tests and all this stuff is relevant. So seeing is believing. Yeah. And now we can have video cameras, of course, and we have a couple in our reserve here. So video cameras can be set in and showing people as well what's there. Yeah, I think in the paper I do list a number of studies and tourism benefits. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the biggest, of course. There's a few examples.
Yep. All right. So Kate's just highlighting we're coming to the end. So if everyone can unmute and thank Mark. Thanks for a very informative and inspirational talk, Mark. Thank you very much.